All right, so in this video, we're going to touch a little bit more on callbacks. And we've been using callbacks up to this point, but I want to show you how we can implement our own function that takes in a callback. Now, before we do that, I'll just kind of give you a recap on things we've already done, like add event listener. So I have a button here, and I have a div with the ID of post, and I just have a little bit of CSS just to style the button, and there's a class of danger that I want to toggle for this button, just to give you an example or a recap of a callback with add event listener. So if I were to select this button, let's say query selector, and select the button, and then we add an event listener, and that takes in an event, and it also takes in a callback. So let's call that callback toggle. All right, and then we'll create a function up here called toggle, which takes in an event object because we're firing off an event. And then we'll just take that e.target, which is the button, and I'm going to just use class list.toggle, which will toggle a class, and I'm going to toggle the class of danger. So if I come over here and click, you'll see that I can toggle the red background. So I did this to just give you a recap of how we've been using callback functions. So this right here is a callback. It's a function that gets passed into another function. All right. Now, one thing I just want to mention is that for beginners, I've seen a lot of them do this when they pass in a callback, and that's not correct. If I save this, what happens is this function is going to get invoked because the parentheses that means that you want to invoke the function. So it doesn't wait for you to click it. And in that case, we get an error because E is not defined, right? So it's trying to read target from undefined. The reason E isn't defined is because the event wasn't fired off, so there's no event object. So just make sure that when you pass in a callback, you don't pass in parentheses. All right, now I want to kind of create our own example of a callback and why it's useful for asynchronous programming. Now, before I do this, I just want to mention that just because you use a callback somewhere doesn't mean it's always asynchronous. In the case of like add event listener and set timeout, we saw that it's asynchronous. It gets put into the task queue. The event loop moves it to the call stack. But in the case of using like for each and map on arrays, those take in callbacks, but it's not asynchronous. Those are executed right away. So just because it's a callback doesn't always mean that it's asynchronous. All right, so what we're going to do here is create just a very simple array of posts. So just a couple objects with a title, let's say post 1, and then we'll have a body, and let's have that say this is post 1. And then we'll create one more, and this will be post 2. Title, let's say post 2. All right, so I want to kind of mimic how this would work if we were fetching this data from a server. So let's create a function called getPosts, and what we're going to do here is we're going to get these using for each, but we're going to wrap it in a set timeout. And the reason for that is because I want to mimic how this would work fetching it from a server. When you fetch from a server, you're making a network request. So that takes some time. I mean, it depends on many different factors, your connection, the server. It depends how long that's going to take, but it could take from, a couple milliseconds to a couple seconds. So what I'm going to do is in the set timeout, we know it takes in a function, right? And then it takes in whatever time we want to wait for this to happen. So let's do, let's say 1 second. Okay, we want this to take 1 second. And then in here, we'll get the post by just doing a for each. So we'll say post for each, and then we'll pass in a function. And again, this is a callback, but it's not asynchronous in this case. So we'll say function for each post, then let's add them to the DOM. So I'll create a variable called div. And this is all stuff we've done, right? So document dot, let's say create element. And in this case, we're creating a div. And then let's say that div inner HTML, I'm going to set that to just some backticks. And in here, let's do a strong tag for the title. Okay, so in the strong tag, we'll put the post title. So let's put our money sign curly braces and post.title. And then after the strong tag, we'll just go like this and we'll say post.body. Okay, then we just need to add it to the DOM. So let's say document.query selector, and we're going to select the ID of posts, which I already have in the HTML, and then we're going to append child, and we want to append that div. All right, and then we just need to call the function. So down here, let's say get posts. Oops, it should not be a 0. I always do that. All right, so I'll save, and you'll notice that after a second, the posts show on the page. So this replicates sending a network request out to some backend, some API that gives us posts, and then we put it on the page, right? Now, we're going to create a function to create a new post. So let's go right here, and let's say function, and let's say create post. All right, now, again, when you're creating a post, you're reaching out to a server, you're making a post request, an HTTP request, and you're sending data to add to the post, and whether it's a database or wherever it goes, right? So let's pass in post, and to replicate this network request, I'll do another set timeout, right? And then that takes in a function. And then this time I'm going to say this is going to take 2 seconds, right? So 2000. Whoops, what am I doing? So 2000, and then to add a post, we're just simply going to say post, get the array, and push the new post. All right, so now we have create posts and get posts, and they're both kind of replicating a network request. So let's go ahead and create a post. So create post. And that's going to, we'll just pass in an object with a title of, let's say, post 3, and the body of, we'll just say this is post 3. All right, so now we're going to create a post and then get the post. So let's save and see what happens. So it just shows us post 1 and post 2. Post 3 is not there. And the reason for this is create posts took longer than get posts. And that's something that could definitely happen if you're reaching out to a server. You never know how long it's going to take to do for each operation or each request. Now, to solve this issue, what we're going to do is use a callback function. We're going to make this get posts a callback of create posts. So I'm going to pass in addition to the post itself, a function. I'm just going to call it CB. That's kind of a common naming convention. And then what we want to do is after the post is created here, we're going to then execute that CB, that callback function. And then down here, instead of calling get posts here, we're going to pass it in as a callback to create posts. Okay, and not like this. You don't want to put the parentheses because that will execute it right away. We want this to get executed here when it's passed in and then after the posts are created. So let's save and see what happens. So now it's going to wait a couple seconds, and then when it does show our post, it's going to include the post we created with this function. All right, and just to reiterate, it calls create posts, adds the post to the array, but then it doesn't call get posts until after it's added here. All right, and then it waits another second. So altogether, we're waiting 3 seconds, right? It waits 2 seconds, adds the post, calls the callback, waits another second, and then shows the post. Now, at least from my own experience, you're probably not going to be doing this type of thing where you're creating your own callbacks until you get into much more advanced JavaScript. You'll be using callbacks all the time like we've been doing with set timeout, set interval, add event listener, map, for each. We're passing in callbacks, but I find that there's not a ton of cases where I need to execute my own callbacks and structure it all from scratch like this until you get into more advanced JavaScript. Now I want to start to get into making actual HTTP requests. Here we kind of mimicked one with the set timeout, but now I want to actually show you how to do that. And before we get into writing the code for it, I want to talk a little bit about what HTTP requests are.